get started?
Sure.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Vera, you are a food addiction expert, author of the book Food Junkies, The Truth About Food Addiction. You're a speaker, and your website is addictionunplugged.com.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Vera. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking me.
So, in your book, you talk about that there's no chance of recovery if the addiction is not recognized and treated. And one of the things I really appreciated about your book was inclusion of the fact that we do have this obesogenic environment, this food environment that's just riddled with junk food, and it does promote excessive eating of those foods.
Absolutely.
And you point out that it's easy to overlook food addiction in this type of an environment unless you're actually looking for it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you define what food addiction is and how it differs from an eating disorder?
But the essential difference between a food addiction and an eating disorder is that an eating disorder is a psychological impairment or disorder where people are struggling to use their food or their eating behavior as a way to rectify some other psychological dynamic, maybe trauma in the past, sexual abuse, a way to manage their emotions through externalizing by eating, like with their food behavior. And the idea is if you correct that problem, then the food will just take care of itself. So the focus is let's keep the food as, quote, normal as possible, which means the food that we're eating out there, including the bad stuff, the processed food industries, panorama of offerings. But the main goal is what's the psychic dynamic and can we fix that? With food addiction, we say it doesn't matter. You can be happy, sad, glad, mad. You can be anything you want. It depends on the food. And if you're eating non-triggering foods, you can be as depressed as you want and you're not going to pick up necessarily. You can be as happy as you want and you won't pick up. But it doesn't matter what mood you're in. If you pick up food like sugars and processed foods, you're going to want to eat. It doesn't matter how psychically sound or unsound you are. So the focus is on the substance externally that you're putting into your mouth with food addiction, and the other one, it's what's going on in your brain, and then you're using food as a symptom.
When someone eats a trigger food, what neurologically happens in the brain when they're eating that?
So the theory here is that we're looking at the the limbic system, the hedonic pathway, and what we're saying is anything that fires that up then predisposes the person to anything else that will fire it up. So it can be, I mean, the important piece here that I'm going to try to get at is it can be food, it can be cigarettes, it can be cocaine, it can be marijuana, it can be gambling, sex, whatever, internet. If it fires it up, then you've essentially opened the pathway or the gateway, the gatekeeper to any other abuse. What we found is that processed foods deliberately do that. That's why we choose them, because they make us feel better, especially if you're feeling a little bit low. It's a real pick-me-up, but it's a big pick-me-up. The piece about addiction that's so important is once you're living in that land of, instead of the ordinary, the extraordinary, you start to develop a taste for that. It's like the chasing the dragon phenomena. Once you have a little bit of this and you have more and you start living in the more because you're eating that stuff all the time, that we essentially become tolerant to that. And now we need even more to feel better. And so it ends up being that we're constantly trying to get this larger than life experience, which actually just feels normal to us because we've become tolerant to it. And that can happen with food. It can happen first with drugs and alcohol. Often what happens is that people, when they're start with food when they're teenagers, they discover sweets, then they gain weight, then they start to go on a diet, and then you go on a diet, and then that makes you want to eat even more. And then you realize at the age of 18, 19, oh my God, I've got to stop. So you pick up cigarettes or something else, booze, stop eating. By the time you're 30, I'm just telling you, this is what I see all the time in my clinics. By the time you're 30, 35, you're saying, I think I'm drinking too much. I think I better quit smoking, put it down, and the food comes back. But it comes back big time. And then you get caught in this thing. And if you don't see addiction for what it is, you never get out of it. You just get caught in this web, this sort of Charlotte's web of being pulled from one substance to another or back and forth. And it's not an eating disorder, even though it looks like one.
Yeah, and in your book, you talk about food addiction as a chronic progressive condition, and
Right.
that you use the analogy of an elevator that goes only down, but you have the opportunity, or you can get off at any floor.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little more about the stages, the 4 stages, the early, middle, late?
Sure.
And then also maybe talk about how you can recover from food addiction before it progresses to the next stage.
So stage 1, you're starting to think about your food. You're not obsessing, but it's sticky. It's there. It's I'm not going to eat now, but I'm looking forward to tonight. I'm looking forward to the weekend and the big whatever it is that we're going to have. It just starts there. So obsession is the first thing. It starts off as being, we call it craving, that eventually becomes an obsession. And that will develop and develop and develop and continually get worse. So that by stage 4, you're not just obsessing to the point of thinking about it, but it is your first choice. I wake up in the morning, what am I going to have? And as I'm eating my breakfast, I'm thinking about lunch. And as I'm thinking about lunch, I'm already thinking, do I have enough for dinner? And will I have enough to get through the night? Like life revolves around food. Obsession becomes not just craving, but obsession. Then the second thing is, can I control my amount? So early stage, you're thinking about it, you can still control it. Second stage, control is a little bit less, but it's still there. Third stage is the next criteria, is it starting to impair? Am I starting to gain more weight than I really is acceptable to me? Am I starting to get diabetes? Am I starting to get arthritis? All those things. So is impairment happening? That's the third. Obsession. I can't control it anymore. It's actually impairing me. And then the next one, can I, even when I want to stop, when I want to put the brakes on, can I? No, I can't. Can't stop anymore. And fourth stage, sort of in the stages of addiction, it's not really discrete stages. It's a gradual continuum. Addiction has this amazing commonality amongst all of us where we diminish or deny it. It's not that bad. Or, you've got a problem, but I don't really have a problem. I will be able to stop, just not today. I'll stop tomorrow. Like, we'll diminish the problem. We'll deny that it actually exists. When you have all of those criteria, that fits addiction. And
can someone just stay in like the first stage and just be there, or does it typically happen where someone kind of goes through all the stages eventually?
I actually think that it depends on external and internal criteria, and this is a common across all addictions. So is a person predisposed to addiction in the first place? And we know that the dopamine 2 receptors are impaired or different, or that there appears to be a genetic predisposition to alcoholism. And that that there's been a lot of research done around the dopamine 2 receptors, and that's just that. I mean, there's more than just the dopamine 2 receptor, but that's an area that there's a lot of research in, and that appears to be a genetic piece. So it's kind of like somebody may have already a predisposition, so that their first drink or their first food was great, whereas for somebody else it's like, yeah, it's good, but it's not. I'm full, I really should stop now, or I've reached a certain weight and I'm not happy with this and I can stop. Whereas the addict, the person with the impaired dopamine receptor, genetic or not, is struggling because it's almost like the yes, I like to say it as the yes versus the no. The yes is just too big, it's too inviting.
My next question is, you say that recovery involves abstaining from the
Yeah.
trigger foods.
Yes.
Why doesn't moderation work then?
There are some people who can find that they can stop, and that the obsession doesn't go beyond because they're not genetically predisposed, or they just simply haven't had quite enough access yet. It's like when a person starts smoking cigarettes, if they're just doing it on weekends once in a while, and they're it's not part of their mentality, like I want to look cool with my friends or something like that. They're not going to intentionally smoke more, so they cross that line where now they've developed a tolerance and a dependency, right? So and this, a lot of drinkers can do that. They can, get drunk, or cocaine users on weekend, and manage to moderate that because they're in the early stages. But if you put lots of access, by which I mean a lot of drug, whatever it is, food or whatever it is, and make the route of entry faster, so that I might be able to drink alcohol, but if I or even use cocaine, but if I start smoking it like crack, or snorting it, or injecting it even more so, it goes to the brain faster, and so I become an addict more quickly. And similarly with food, if I'm ingesting a lot of it quickly, I'm more likely. So that person early stage is not probably at that stage, and they can stop. And when we've done research on numbers of how many food addicts are there in America, the numbers are anywhere from, I don't know, 6-7% of the population to 40% of the population. It's a big variation. The 6-7% is probably the full population, and I actually think that's a dated number, like of 10 years ago. I think we're getting worse. But in the obese population, it's probably 40 to 50%. If you are not in that 50%, then you can moderate. So you're not actually an addict. You're not predisposed. You haven't had enough exposure. Your receptors are still able to bounce back, so that there's not enough of an impairment. Moderation will work for those folks. But once you've reached beyond that point where you've impaired the dopamine receptors, the theory is you can heal yourself well enough, but so that you'll functionally look okay. You're fine, but the moment you have a little bit of a charge of dopamine, it's like a kindled fire, it flares up. And that person cannot have just a little bit of sugar. In the addiction world, we say, one is too many and 1,000 is not enough, because the one starts the flame of the whole dopamine hunger. Best to avoid it. So, in the addiction world, we say, do your research. If you can have a drink, then you're not an alcoholic. You don't have this whole impairment thing. Go for it. That's fine. But if you find that one always leads you back into rehab, always leads you back into misery and overuse, then abstinence is the best for you. And it's not just that you won't get worse, you also won't be craving all the time, because one little bit will reignite that craving. And what part of the good news of the message that I want to give, and those of us in this field, is if you actually abstain, you avert that whole desire, which ends up, when you stop feeling like deprivation, which ends up feeling miserable. If you circuit that and walk around that, after a certain point, you habituate back to normal food, and there's no misery, there's no craving, there's no deprivation. It's actually a life free of craving.
What does withdrawal look like when you eliminate sugar or flour from your diet? Like, how long does it take? What are some of the common symptoms that one would expect if they decide to eliminate it, a trigger food?
Okay, so food, when we talk about food addiction, we usually mean, number one, sugar, and then refined carbs. We don't usually mean fats, proteins, behaviors until you get into later stages. So it's almost like early stage is you're just eating too much sugar, too many carbs, too many potato chips and muffins and stuff like that. But over a period of time, more and more gets included. So even behaviors like just the process of eating itself, particular foods like a crunch or the smell of something, like more will trigger you. So withdrawal is primarily we're talking sugar and refined carbs. So the withdrawal there is, I would like to say it's essentially slow motion alcohol and slow motion alcohol withdrawal. So the first thing will be always craving, obsession, thinking about it, feeling of deprivation. When you feel deprived, that's the beginning of a withdrawal. And I want to emphasize that because if you're feeling deprived and you're thinking, oh my God, this is my life, I'm always going to wish for this, favorite food that I always used to eat. No, you won't. It's just part of the withdrawal, and you'll just want it for probably 10 days to 2 weeks. So I work at Renascent, and we have a food addiction in-house program, not operating right now because of COVID, but I mean, normally we have one. And we typically see people, they go in for a month. So they're essentially in lockdown for a month. You can't sneak away and have a little bit of something in the middle of the night, because you're in a treatment center. People will suffer for the first week, and that's craving and irritability, and they can't sleep, and they're thinking about food, and just irritable and very, very volatilely emotional. Then around I used to think it took 3 weeks. It actually really just takes 10 to 14 days. They're starting to feel relief. And what is the relief? It's some of those symptoms, the agitation, but it's actually just lessening of the cravings. And by the time 3 weeks runs around, they're feeling fabulous. However, and this is not part of the withdrawal, so the answer to your question is probably 2 to 3 weeks of agitation, anxiety, insomnia, craving. Then it starts to get better. But there is a but. And if you've been using food, and even the addiction itself, and this is not just for food addiction, but any addiction, you might be using the addiction itself as a way to cope with life. This is my problem. And so the other problems, like what kind of job am I going to do, and where am I going to live, and do I want to still live with my partner? Those things were shadowed, or they were shadows in the face of the addiction. Well, when the addiction is no longer taking your time, those things come back. And what we saw is that people would get very, like their problems came up in their face, and they didn't have food to get in the way. After they dealt with the withdrawal, then they had to deal with their emotions. And that's not an easy job, not easy.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it better? So if someone has both a food addiction as well as maybe some sort of unresolved issue from the past that they haven't, dealt with, is it best to deal with the food addiction first, or deal with the problem, or try to deal with them simultaneously?
Yeah, and that is a question that is a super big question in the therapeutic community. I come from the school of thought that says that you have to be abstinent first. And be aware in the addiction world that there's a whole other way of thinking that says, no, you got to deal with the problem first, or simultaneously. But the perspective that I'm coming from is the tools that you will need to resolve those issues are being hijacked by the drug. You can't, the last thing I want to do is sit you in a room by yourself, take an hour of the day to explore issues with you, leave, and then there you are sitting there, and you don't know what to do with yourself. You've got 23 hours left of the day that you have to deal with yourself. And if you don't have the wherewithal, the clarity of mind to start doing the work of recovery, not only of the addiction itself, but of all these other issues, I'm just re-traumatizing you. So I would say, first of all, get clean, but do not talk about issues like trauma stuff. No, you're not ready for that. What I might do is teach you tools for when you are ready, like mindfulness and prayer, support. So you might go to a 12-step program or you go to rational recovery. There's all sorts of different ways to do this. But building your support network and your tools, get clean, get some clean time behind you, at least 2 to 3 months at least. Have your supports, and then you can start to edge into figuring out those problems with a clear mind. Because it's you that has to do the healing. Me as the clinician helping you, or the sponsor helping you, or the counselor helping you, all I can do is direct you into doing helping you do what you have to do yourself. And you can't do that if you're high on food or drug.
So let's say that you recover from a food addiction and a few months goes by. What are some common reasons for relapses?
Well, wow, the biggest one, the biggest one is that we live in an obesogenic, toxic food environment. And, it has been, and I mean, we were not, most of us were not born as food addicts. We became them because we were invited into the world of eating all this stuff. We can't leave that world. It would be great if we could leave that world. And in a sense, that's what support systems, where they, and there are some 12-step programs where they say, you gotta call a sponsor or somebody 3 times a day and go to a meeting you say, whoa, wait a minute. What am I going to do with that? I don't have time to do all that stuff. But what we're essentially trying to get you to do is build something that is as intense as what you're going back to, which is, it is insidious. It's ubiquitous everywhere, the invitation to eat. So what is it that makes us trip up? It's all the unconscious cues, the smells, me watching you pour your latte and oh my God, I want that latte. I don't even know that I'm wanting it when I watch you pouring something into your drink. But we can't isolate ourselves from that environment. Can't. So that's the biggest cue, is just coming back into the world. If you live in a world where you have kids and the kids are eating that stuff, and if you don't insist that they follow, it's going to be hard. If your partner doesn't hide the food, if they're cooking it and you're smelling it, I mean, this is all very hard.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book a story about Clara who recovered, and then she went home and her daughter, who had no intentions on eliminating the foods that she recovered from her diet, but she was cooking for her mom, but she had all those things in the house, readily accessible. And then that was her reason for relapsing. That's what caused her relapse.
Yeah.
And your comment about every granny is a pusher.
Yeah.
It's so true.
Yeah, it's not actually not my comment, but I love that one because it speaks so true. It's with the best of intentions that somebody makes something for you and says, come on, I made it for you. And, that's like saying, have a little bit of cocaine. I got it for you. I had to, go to
So how would someone respond to that? Because people are very much, wanting to not, ruffle the feathers with friends or family. How do you politely decline, offers to eat some of those trigger foods?
Yeah, well, there's if you go into the various support havens like 12-step groups, or now there's Facebook groups, this is the stuff of the conversation. It's always this kind of stuff. So it'll be anything from thank you, I've already eaten, I'll take it and deal with it later. Not saying what you're going to do with it. If I'm at a party, I'll take the plate, thank you, and then go and put it down somewhere else later. To saying I've already eaten, to I'm not I'm allergic to this stuff, or it's all evasive ways to be polite. And it is the stuff of all of these support things, is how to do this. And it's true, we don't know how to, we classify this in the addiction world as boundary setting. How do you set boundaries? And sometimes, I know this from my own personal experience, the connection that I had with the person was that, we would get together and eat, have these wonderful big meals where we would, eat like crazy. Now I can't do that anymore. And, it ends up being awkward to be with the person. especially if
Yeah.
they want to do it, it becomes awkward. It's a bit like going to a bar and watching everybody else get drunk.
Yeah,
And
yeah. If you have an alcohol abuse problem, you mentioned another key point that I want to bring up too, which are hidden trigger, like foods that are like hidden within other foods that you just don't realize are in there.
yes.
Do you want to comment on those hidden food triggers?
Well, there's all the hidden sugars, and so people will often say, so what about honey? That's healthy. What about agave juice, or that's healthy. What about so it's not white refined sugar. What about brown sugar? Isn't that okay? How about brown bread instead of white bread? Um, uh, it's all the hidden sugars. So and also in processed food where you don't even know that there's sugar in there, like who.
What about diet soda or diet soft drinks?
Yeah, so this is one of those gray areas. So remember you were asking me about the different stages of addiction. If a person is in stage 1, they might be able to get away with a little bit of sugar once in a while. They might. If they're in stage 2, they may have decided, okay, I can't do sugar anymore, but I'm going to do a sweetener, and they might be able to get away with it. Yeah, it just depends on how, I want to say almost how robust, or alternatively, how impaired the dopamine receptors are. Because you can, first of all, we're discovering that even sweeteners have an insulin effect, and insulin has an effect on dopamine. There's a connection right there. And when there's higher insulin, there's a higher dopamine effect. But even without the hormonal piece, the actual thing, the anticipation of sweet, because that's what sweeteners do. It's not a sweetener. It's not sweet. It's not sugar, but it makes you think it is. That is already giving a dopamine surge because it's anticipating. Dopamine is just anticipation. So if you're at a certain level, probably between 2 and 3 of 4 stages, you probably can't do sweeteners anymore. And we usually, if a person has come to the place where they're saying, I have a problem with food, we usually say, if you want to be squeaky clean and just start from a trigger-free platform, get rid of the sweetener.
Yeah.
And then if you really want to try later, if you want to take a chance, you might be able to get away with it, but you might not. So do you really want to take that chance?
Right.
Yeah.
So does spirituality have a role in recovery?
It depends. Well, it depends on this perspective that you use. I would like to say yes, because food is it's a primary. It's built into our DNA to want food, to like food. It's primary. When you've done something that's disordered that whole system, that's a pretty basic disorder, and I think it's really important, if you deal with the biological piece of this, don't forget there's the whole sociological and then other than that, which I would call the spiritual, that is also built around eating and the social aspect of eating and more than that. So when you start addressing that, I don't know if this is why I don't think medication is enough. You have to clean up the social, make sure your friends are on board with you. But I think it's more than that. I think there has to be more of, why am I doing this? There has to be a sense of meaning, a sense of purposefulness, which we can call spirituality. I mean, you can call it God if you want. You can call it spiritual higher power if you want. It doesn't have to be. It can just be, I'm doing this. That's going to be very hard and disturbing, especially in the first few weeks. And there has to be a reason for this. The reason might be so I can help people with this later. So I can be the person that I want to be, the kind person that I want to be. There has to be something more. And this is not just food. This is anything. If I have a patient sitting in front of me and they do not have any kind of connection to humanity outside of just themselves, but the desire to help in some way, I'm always thinking, they're just going to go back because life is hard, and you have to have something that makes you be able to withstand that hard while it's happening. And medication is just not enough. It will blunt the edge of the pain, but it won't give you a sense of purpose. So that's what I would call a spiritual, and we can find that through just mindfulness meditation all the way up to active service. So in the 12-step program, there's, you know, the 12th step is I'm returning the message back to you. I want to help you now, based on my experience. We see that in religion too. You know, the whole art of proselytizing, whether you like it or not, it helps the person.
So you discussed that it often takes someone with a food addiction to hit rock bottom before that magical moment when they're spiritually awakened and ready to fight the demons of food addiction.
Right.
And
Did
sadly,
I use those words?
you did, and I'm quoting you from your book. Yeah.
Okay.
And sadly, you pointed out that in the stories that you profiled of some of the people, that some of them end up dying prematurely and
Yeah.
are never able to experience that recovery.
Yeah.
So
I see it in my work all the time. You know, what is it that makes one person stop and another? You know, the magical moment can just be I've had enough pain. That the pain is just the pain of whatever it's going to be for me to stop cannot be worse than the pain of this same old, same old, same old. You know, they always say the definition of insanity is expecting a different reward. Well, it's when you finally realize that, no, it's going to be the same thing. If I keep doing the same thing, it's the same thing. And I just cannot go through this again. So it's different versions of that. Can't do this anymore. You've just had so much. And it makes sense because ultimately, you know, we do things because there has to be some, it can be a lying to ourselves that this next time will be different. But ultimately, there always has to be some level of hope somewhere for a person to move into something. And when that hope is extinguished, that's what we call hitting bottom. Mm-hmm. There's just no more hope here. And then hopefully a seed has been planted. This is where 12-step proselytizing comes in. You know, keep coming back. Maybe the miracle will happen today. Or it might just be that you picked up the book of my book or something and you go, oh, I'm actually hearing this now. Hopefully at that point when you feel like there's nothing here, I'm just doing the same thing all the time and I feel awful, that you then realize, well, maybe this will work. Maybe. Yeah. And that's the turning point right there.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, final thoughts. First of all, read my book, please. Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction, because it gives the science of this. And the message that I want to give is that myself and many others that I talk about in the book, but it's there in the community, have said, first of all, here is a phenomenon, it's called addiction, first to sugar and flour, and then it can expand beyond that. It is difficult at first to abstain, therefore you get support, coaching and support. And if you can get through that first few weeks, then the goal is just to maintain sobriety. Again, you need support. But the good news is it's not a painful feeling of deprivation. It's actually a feeling of joy and freedom. And that's the message of hope. It's joy and freedom from addiction and also weight loss or weight maintenance anyway. So there is hope. It's actually a very positive message of hope. Just go for it.
Well, Dr. Vera, your book was very eye-opening to me. I definitely think it's a must read for anybody who either thinks they have a food addiction or is living with someone with a food addiction. And honestly, it should be, I think, required reading for pretty much any healthcare provider that's working with clients dealing with issues like this. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for the interview.